The mansion still stands, but it no longer guards what it once contained. Its gates remain closed, its walls intact, its symmetry preserved. Yet preservation is not the same as survival. What endures here is a shell, immaculately maintained, carefully insured, and fundamentally emptied of its original purpose. This was not a house designed for comfort or display. It was built as an instrument, a place where capital rested, where decisions slowed the pace of nations, where silence itself had value. The rooms were calibrated for discretion. The distance between the street and the front door was deliberate. Privacy was not a preference but a strategy. Today, the mansion exists in a different economy. Its secrecy is procedural, not ideological. Its security protects absence rather than influence. The rituals that once animated the building, meetings without minutes, conversations without witnesses, authority exercised without announcement, have vanished, leaving behind architecture that still expects them to return. This is the quiet transformation that defines elite decline. Not collapse, not scandal, not fire or ruin, simply a shift in function so complete that meaning drains away while the structure remains. The building is still called important, it is still described as historic, but history is no longer being made inside it. This story matters because it reveals how power actually ends. Not when it is defeated, but when it outlives the system that required it. When stewardship becomes maintenance. When legacy becomes real estate. When a mansion designed to concentrate control is reduced to guarding its own memory. In the present day, the mansion remains sealed behind protocols that once implied consequence. Access is controlled, schedules are fixed, security is continuous. The mechanisms of protection are still in place, but they now guard something different. Where authority once required insulation, the building now preserves continuity alone. Its systems persist even as their original purpose has faded. The exterior presents no sign of decline. Stonework is maintained. Sightlines are preserved. Landscaping follows long-established patterns, trimmed not for beauty but for discipline. Nothing here suggests abandonment. Yet nothing here suggests urgency either. The mansion no longer operates at the tempo for which it was designed. Time moves more slowly inside, not because of deliberation, but because nothing presses against it. Internally, the structure still behaves as if decisions are expected. Rooms are arranged for private convergence. Corridors assume discrete movement. Doors close with the weight of habit, not necessity. The architecture has not been repurposed, it has simply been paused. This distinction matters. Repurposing would imply adaptation. Pausing implies waiting. The mansion's current caretaking reflects this suspended state. Maintenance follows institutional schedules rather than lived rhythms. Systems are tested, logs are kept, routines are executed without deviation. Yet these actions no longer support an active center of power. They support preservation itself. The building has become an object of stewardship rather than a site of authority. This shift is subtle and therefore easy to misunderstand. From the outside, the mansion appears unchanged. Its privacy remains intact. Its scale still intimidates. Its reputation persists in abstraction. But power is not maintained by appearance, it is maintained by use. And here, use has narrowed to upkeep. The silence inside the mansion is not the silence of secrecy. It is the silence of absence. Meetings no longer shape outcomes beyond the property. Conversations do not travel outward with consequence. Decisions made here, when they occur at all, do not alter external systems. The building still contains space for influence, but influence no longer arrives. What remains is a disciplined emptiness. Furniture stays positioned for gatherings that do not take place. Lighting is calibrated for focus that is no longer required. The mansion continues to anticipate authority because it was built to assume its permanence. Architecture does not adapt quickly to irrelevance. This is how elite spaces often outlast elite systems. They are too expensive, too controlled, too symbolically dense to disappear quickly. Instead, they enter a prolonged afterlife. They persist as stabilized environments long after the conditions that justified them have eroded. In this phase, the mansion functions as a survivor rather than a participant. It has endured transitions in ownership structure, financial context, and cultural relevance without physical disruption. But endurance is not influence. The building still commands resources, but it no longer directs them. What makes this stage difficult to perceive is its calm. There is no visible crisis, No legal struggle, no public reckoning, no sudden conversion into spectacle. The loss is internal. The mansion has crossed from being a node within a living system to being a record of one. Its protections now preserve memory more than power. The walls still hold, the gates still close, but what they enclose is no longer central to the forces that once required such careful containment. In this state, the mansion no longer generates momentum, it absorbs it. External attention arrives cautiously, filtered through administrative layers that emphasize protection over engagement. The building is referenced more often than it is entered. Its name circulates in documents, not conversations. It functions as a credential rather than a command center. The routines that persist are managerial, not strategic. Inspections replace deliberations. Compliance replaces discretion. Where judgment once operated informally, procedure now governs every action. This is not corruption of the original system, but its final refinement rules without purpose, order without outcome. Even the mansion's invisibility has changed character. Once, obscurity enhanced leverage. What was unknown could not be challenged. Today, obscurity serves caution. The building withdraws not to act unseen, but to avoid being redefined. Its distance from public life is no longer tactical, it is protective. The surrounding environment has adjusted accordingly. The neighborhood treats the mansion as fixed infrastructure rather than a living presence. Traffic patterns bend around it. Local memory preserves it as a constant. It is neither contested nor celebrated. Its continued existence is accepted without inquiry into its relevance. Inside, the mansion maintains conditions suited for authority that no longer needs to arrive. Climate systems hold steady. Surfaces are preserved against wear that no longer threatens them. Even decay has been slowed beyond necessity. The building is kept ready for a function that may never resume. This readiness is not accidental. Elite architecture is trained to resist finality. It was conceived with the expectation that power might retreat temporarily, not dissolve entirely. The mansion's design assumes cycles, not endings. What it does not accommodate is obsolescence. As a result, the building occupies an ambiguous position within the present. It is not abandoned, yet it is no longer essential. It is not active, yet it remains influential in abstraction. This ambiguity allows it to persist without challenge. No confrontation is required when nothing appears to be happening. The mansion's survival, then, is not evidence of strength. It is evidence of inertia. Resources continue to flow toward its maintenance because dismantling it would require admitting that the system which produced it has ended. Preservation becomes a way to delay acknowledgement. In this form, the mansion becomes a reference point rather than a participant. It confirms continuity without contributing to it. It reassures without directing. Its presence stabilizes narratives about legacy, even as those narratives no longer correspond to present power structures. What has disappeared is not wealth, nor even prestige, but function. The mansion no longer concentrates authority. It no longer synchronizes influence across distance. It does not accelerate decisions or shield them from consequence. It stands complete, intact, and strategically unnecessary. This is the quietest form of institutional loss. Nothing has been taken away. Nothing has been destroyed. The mansion remains what it always was in material terms. What has changed is the world around it, and the absence of any force that still requires it to matter. Here, power has not fallen. It has moved on. The mansion did not exist to be seen. Its importance was never visual, and its authority was never dependent on recognition. In the ecosystem of elite American power, visibility was a liability. What mattered was insulation, the ability to operate beyond noise, beyond reaction, beyond the rhythms of public life. This house provided that insulation with precision. Its value lay in separation. Physical distance from urban centers was only the first layer. More important was procedural distance, the separation between decision and consequence, between action and attribution. The mansion allowed power to be exercised slowly, privately, and without explanation. It was a place where outcomes could be shaped before they entered public view, when options were still reversible and responsibility was still diffuse. This was not symbolic wealth staged for admiration. It was operational wealth designed for endurance. The mansion functioned as infrastructure. Like a private clearinghouse, it enabled alignment between capital, legal structure, and social authority without requiring formal assembly. What occurred here did not need to be recorded to be effective. Culturally, the mansion reinforced a specific understanding of legitimacy. Authority did not need to persuade. It did not need to perform transparency. Its justification lay in continuity, decades of uninterrupted presence, consistent ownership, and disciplined withdrawal from spectacle. The building embodied the idea that stability itself conferred right. Institutionally, this space solved a recurring problem faced by elite systems: how to persist across generations without fragmenting. Public institutions change leadership frequently. Corporations answer to markets. Political offices turn over. The mansion offered something different: a stable environment where long-term thinking could survive short-term disruption. It allowed strategy to outlast individuals. The house also structured behavior. Its form enforced restraint. Rooms were designed to limit audience size. Circulation patterns reduced chance encounters. Silence was not merely aesthetic, it was functional. By controlling who met, where, and under what conditions, the mansion shaped outcomes before deliberation even began. This control extended to time. The mansion was built to slow processes down. Distance from daily pressures created space for deferral. Decisions could wait. Waiting was itself a form of power. Those who could afford delay could observe others exhaust their options. The building facilitated this patience by removing urgency from its interior logic. Equally important was what the mansion excluded. There was no need for public affirmation, no reliance on popularity, no requirement to explain or justify. The absence of these pressures allowed for consistency. Positions could remain unchanged across decades. Policies could be reinforced quietly, incrementally, without triggering resistance. In this way, the mansion served as a cultural stabilizer. It anchored a worldview in which authority was inherited, managed, and preserved rather than contested. It normalized the idea that influence should operate out of sight, protected by discretion and continuity rather than law or consent. The place mattered because it allowed power to behave as a long-term system rather than a series of events. It made endurance possible, and in elite structures, endurance is the highest form of success. Beyond its immediate function, the mansion acted as a cultural filter. Access was not simply restricted, it was calibrated. Those who entered were already aligned with the values the building reinforced. This reduced the need for negotiation. Consensus was assumed, not debated. The house did not create agreement, it selected for it. This selective environment allowed informal authority to flourish. Influence moved through familiarity rather than command. Decisions emerged from shared assumptions, reinforced over time through repeated interaction within the same controlled space. The mansion enabled this by remaining constant while the external world shifted around it. The absence of formal structure was itself a strength. Without agendas or minutes, authority remained flexible. Outcomes could be attributed to market forces, regulatory shifts, or cultural trends rather than to deliberate choice. The building provided a buffer that absorbed accountability while allowing influence to persist. This mattered especially in periods of transition. Economic cycles, political realignments, and social upheavals passed through the mansion as variables to be managed rather than crises to be confronted. The house allowed elites to observe instability without being drawn into it. Distance created perspective, and perspective preserved advantage. The mansion also functioned as a site of intergenerational continuity. Younger figures entered as observers before becoming participants. Norms were transmitted quietly, without instruction. The building itself taught behavior: how long to listen, when to speak, when silence carried more weight than intervention. Over time, this produced a self-reinforcing culture. The mansion did not need to assert its relevance. Its mere persistence signaled legitimacy. Longevity substituted for explanation. Those outside its walls might not know what occurred within, but they understood that what lasted must matter. In this sense, the house operated as a stabilizing myth. Not a falsehood, but a shared assumption that certain centers of influence were permanent fixtures. This belief reduced uncertainty across the system. Markets, institutions, and individuals adjusted their expectations accordingly. What made the mansion indispensable was not any single decision made there, but the continuity it provided across countless decisions that were never documented. It allowed power to remain diffuse, untraceable, and therefore resilient. When such a place functions properly, it becomes invisible by design. Its success lies in not needing recognition. The mansion mattered because it made authority sustainable without ever needing to appear accountable. Its relevance was measured not by moments of action, but by decades without interruption. The mansion was conceived long before its foundations were laid. Its origins do not begin with land acquisition or architectural drawings, but with an assumption that power, properly organized, could be made durable. This was not a speculative belief. It was a guiding principle shared across elite American institutions at the turn of consolidation. An understanding that wealth alone was insufficient without a structure capable of containing it across time. The decision to build was therefore not reactive. It did not answer an immediate need, it anticipated one. The mansion was planned as an anchor point for authority that was expected to persist, not fluctuate. Its purpose was to outlast individuals, markets, and political cycles. Architecture was chosen as the medium precisely because it resists revision. Location was the first assertion of intent. The site was selected not for convenience, but for control. Distance mattered. Elevation mattered. Access routes were considered in terms of visibility and approach, not traffic. The mansion was placed where arrival required intention. This alone filtered participation. Those who reached it had already accepted its terms. The surrounding environment was treated as part of the design. Natural barriers reduced intrusion. Sightlines extended outward, reinforcing awareness without exposure. The building was not meant to dominate its landscape visually. It was meant to settle into it, implying permanence rather than assertion. The message was subtle but unmistakable. This structure was not temporary. The architectural language reinforced this expectation. Materials were chosen for endurance rather than novelty. Proportions favored stability over display. The design avoided fashionable elements that would date quickly. Instead, it relied on established forms associated with continuity and restraint. The mansion was built to appear inevitable, not impressive. Internally, the layout prioritized function over ornament. Spaces were scaled to human interaction rather than spectacle. The building assumed that its most consequential moments would occur quietly, between small groups, without audience or record. This assumption shaped everything from room dimensions to circulation paths. The mansion's creators understood architecture as a disciplining force. Walls guide behavior. Distance regulates conversation. Enclosure concentrates attention. By fixing these elements in stone, the building enforced a particular mode of operation. It reduced variability. It encouraged consistency. Over time, it trained its occupants to think in longer horizons. Crucially, the design assumed stewardship rather than turnover. Ownership was expected to remain concentrated. Authority was presumed to be inherited or transferred within a narrow circle. The mansion was not prepared for fragmentation. Its scale and rigidity reflected confidence that the system sustaining it would remain intact. This confidence was not naive. It was informed by prevailing economic structures, legal frameworks, and cultural norms that favored accumulation and continuity. The mansion was a physical manifestation of these conditions, built with the expectation that they would endure. In this sense, the building did not merely house power. It expressed a belief about how power should exist, quietly, privately, and without interruption. Architecture became ideology made permanent, encoding assumptions about permanence into every surface and corridor. That intent extended beyond durability into control over interpretation. The mansion was designed to resist reinterpretation by future occupants. Its rigidity limited alternative uses. Large-scale reconfiguration would be costly, disruptive, and symbolically fraught. In this way, the building constrained not only behavior but imagination. It quietly dictated how it could be inhabited. This was deliberate. Flexibility introduces uncertainty. A space that can be easily adapted invites competing purposes. The mansion rejected that possibility. Its design assumed alignment between form and function would remain stable across generations. To occupy it properly was to accept its logic. Even aesthetic restraints served this end. Ornamentation was controlled, not absent. Decorative elements reinforced order rather than personality. There were no gestures meant to surprise or provoke. The building did not invite reinterpretation through taste. It imposed continuity through repetition. The mansion's scale reflected similar assumptions. It was large enough to command resources, but not so large as to require public justification. Excessive size attracts scrutiny. Insufficient size invites challenge. The building balanced these pressures carefully, situating itself just beyond the threshold of explanation. Circulation within the structure further revealed its ideological core. Movement was hierarchical but unobtrusive. Some paths were obvious, others concealed. This allowed authority to operate without overt signaling. Those familiar with the building understood where influence flowed. Those less familiar never encountered it directly. In this way, the mansion encoded a theory of power as spatial practice. Authority was not centralized in a throne room or office. It emerged from proximity, access, and repetition. The building facilitated this by privileging certain interactions while rendering others improbable. The assumption of permanence also shaped the mansion's relationship to risk. It was built to absorb uncertainty, not respond to it. Economic volatility, political change, and social pressure were expected to occur elsewhere. The mansion's role was to remain unaffected long enough for conditions to stabilize. This expectation justified investment in redundancy. Systems overlapped. Failures could be isolated. The building did not depend on efficiency, it depended on reliability. Redundancy is expensive, but it signals confidence that the future will require stability more than speed. The mansion's creators also assumed cultural deference. They built within a context where elite withdrawal was interpreted as seriousness, not absence. Privacy conferred authority rather than suspicion. The design relied on this cultural understanding, embedding it into the structure itself. As a result, the mansion did not need to explain itself. Its existence functioned as its own rationale. The longer it stood, the more legitimate it appeared. Time became an ally. The building accrued authority simply by remaining unchanged. This is how architecture extends ideology beyond its original moment. The beliefs that shaped the mansion's creation were fixed into stone, wood, and spatial hierarchy. Even as external conditions evolved, the building continued to assert the assumptions of its origin. To enter the mansion was to step into a worldview that predated the present. The structure did not ask whether those assumptions still applied. It enforced them through scale, silence, and endurance. In this way, the mansion was never neutral. From its inception, it was an argument about permanence, about control, and about the right to operate beyond visibility. That argument did not need to be spoken, it was built to last. The mansion's power was never concentrated in a single room or individual. It resided in sequence, in repetition, in the quiet reliability of systems that operated the same way every day, regardless of who passed through them. What sustained authority here was not command, but routine. Daily life inside the mansion followed a hierarchy that was rarely stated and never questioned. Roles were clearly defined, not through written doctrine, but through proximity and access. Some staff moved freely between spaces. Others remained bound to narrow corridors and fixed tasks. Visibility itself was stratified. Knowing what was happening was a privilege, not a requirement. The most senior figures were insulated from logistics. Their authority depended on not encountering friction. Meals appeared without inquiry. Schedules adjusted themselves. Interruptions were absorbed before reaching them. This insulation was not indulgence, it was functional. It preserved focus and reinforced the idea that certain individuals existed beyond operational concern. Below this level, discipline governed everything. Timing mattered. Doors opened and closed according to patterns that rarely changed. The same staff handled the same responsibilities for years, sometimes decades. Continuity was valued more than initiative. Innovation risked disruption. Predictability ensured control. Unspoken rules carried more weight than formal instruction. Speech was measured. Questions were avoided unless necessary. Observation was preferred to explanation. Those who lasted longest were those who learned to anticipate needs without acknowledgement. Recognition was minimal by design. Visibility threatened discretion. The mansion's internal economy reflected these priorities. Compensation was stable, not competitive. Loyalty was rewarded with longevity rather than advancement. Staff were not encouraged to move through ranks quickly. Time itself was the incentive. The longer one remained, the more secure one became. Financial flows within the mansion were deliberately opaque. Expenses were authorized through layers that diffused responsibility. Payments appeared routine, rarely debated. The absence of scrutiny signaled trust, but also expectation. The system assumed that its internal actors understood the importance of restraint. What distinguished this environment was not secrecy, but containment. Information circulated internally with care. Nothing urgent was discussed in passing. Nothing consequential was documented unnecessarily. The mansion operated on the principle that records create vulnerability. Memory, shared selectively, was safer. Routines reinforced this logic. Meetings occurred at consistent intervals, in the same spaces, with familiar participants. These gatherings rarely produced dramatic outcomes. Their purpose was alignment, not resolution. Disagreements were softened through repetition. Consensus emerged gradually, often without formal decision. This procedural approach made power durable. Because authority did not rely on singular moments, it was not weakened by their absence. Influence accumulated quietly, distributed across habits rather than declarations. The mansion functioned less like a headquarters and more like a stabilizing environment in which outcomes were shaped over time. Even moments of disruption were absorbed into routine. Unexpected events did not provoke visible reaction. Adjustments were made incrementally. The system valued continuity over speed. Acting too quickly signaled uncertainty. In this way, the mansion became self-regulating. Its culture discouraged excess, confrontation, and exposure. Power was exercised through consistency, not assertion. Those within the system understood that endurance depended on maintaining the rhythm. What occurred here day to day was rarely remarkable. That was the point. The mansion's strength lay in making influence ordinary, embedded in procedure, sustained by repetition, and shielded from spectacle. Over time, these routines produced a closed ecosystem. Entry into the system was rare and carefully mediated. Exit was quieter still. Staff who left did so without ceremony, their absence absorbed seamlessly. The system was designed to register continuity, not individuals. This reduced vulnerability. No single departure disrupted function. Authority moved laterally rather than vertically. Influence did not issue from explicit directives, but from subtle signals, where attention settled, which conversations repeated, which topics were quietly deferred. Those attuned to these cues adjusted behavior accordingly. The mansion rewarded sensitivity over initiative. The absence of spectacle was itself a form of discipline. There were no moments meant to impress, no displays of command. Even hierarchy was understated. Senior figures rarely asserted status openly. Their authority was understood through deference, not announcement. The system relied on mutual recognition rather than enforcement. This environment shaped time differently. Days were structured, but not rushed. Long pauses between actions were normal. Waiting was not inefficiency, it was assessment. The mansion's tempo discouraged reactive behavior. Urgency was treated as a sign of external pressure, something to be resisted rather than accommodated. Financial operations mirrored this restraint. Large decisions were diffused across intervals. Commitments unfolded gradually, often through intermediaries. The mansion's role was not to execute transactions, but to stabilize them. Capital passed through the building as a process, not an event. Because outcomes emerged slowly, accountability remained diffuse. No single meeting could be identified as decisive. No individual could be credited or blamed conclusively. This protected the system from challenge. Power that cannot be localized cannot be easily confronted. The mansion also regulated emotion. Displays of frustration or enthusiasm were discouraged. Neutrality preserved authority. Even disagreement was expressed obliquely, through delay or silence rather than argument. The system functioned best when nothing appeared urgent. Over years, this produced a particular kind of loyalty. Staff did not remain because of charisma or ideology, but because the environment was stable and predictable. Stability became a form of security. Leaving meant re-entering a world governed by volatility and visibility. The mansion's routines thus extended beyond its walls. Those who passed through carried its tempo elsewhere. They learned to value patience, to avoid exposure, to operate within narrow margins. The system reproduced itself culturally, not formally. What sustained power here was not secrecy in the dramatic sense, but regularity. The same paths walked daily, the same rooms used for the same purposes, the same patterns repeated until they became invisible. Power thrived because it did not call attention to itself. This is how the mansion functioned at its core. Not as a site of command, but as an environment where authority was normalized through procedure. Nothing dramatic occurred. Nothing needed to. Influence was maintained by making its exercise indistinguishable from routine. At its height, the mansion was neither dormant nor defensive. It was occupied in the fullest institutional sense, aligned internally, insulated externally, and synchronized with the broader structures that sustained it. Ownership, capital, and social order moved in parallel. Nothing inside the building contradicted what existed beyond it. This coherence was the source of its authority. The mansion's peak was not marked by expansion or display. There were no additions meant to impress, no public gestures announcing success. Full authority expresses itself through certainty, not assertion. The building did not need to signal relevance. It assumed it. Its routines intensified rather than changed. What had been procedural became decisive. During this period, the mansion functioned as a point of convergence. Capital arrived already disciplined. Social influence entered already aligned. Legal and financial frameworks outside the property reinforced what occurred within it. The building did not struggle against external pressure. It operated within a favorable equilibrium. Decisions made here did not appear as decisions elsewhere. They emerged as conditions. A shift in investment posture, a pause in expansion, a change in emphasis. The mansion did not announce outcomes. It shaped environments in which certain outcomes became inevitable. This was its greatest efficiency. Authority at this stage relied on mutual reinforcement. Those who gathered within the mansion trusted that their influence would persist beyond the room. Those outside trusted that whatever originated here would be stable, considered, and insulated from reversal. This reciprocal confidence reduced friction. Action did not require persuasion. The building spaces were used as intended. Rooms designed for small deliberations held them. Corridors meant to prevent interruption succeeded. Silence functioned as a working condition rather than an absence. The mansion was fully inhabited by its original logic. Time behaved differently during this era. Deliberation did not slow outcomes, it secured them. Decisions could be delayed without risk because alignment already existed. Waiting did not invite challenge. It signaled strength. The mansion's patience was read as control. Culturally, the house reinforced a hierarchy that extended well beyond its walls. Those who entered did so with deference already established. Authority did not need to be demonstrated internally because it was recognized externally. The building acted as a validator rather than a persuader. This was also the period when continuity felt assured. Succession did not threaten coherence. Roles were transferred quietly. Expectations remained unchanged. The mansion's systems absorbed generational movement without visible disruption. Stability appeared natural rather than managed. Importantly, the mansion did not operate alone. Its power depended on alignment with institutions that mirrored its values, financial entities, legal frameworks, and social networks that favored continuity and discretion. The building served as a stabilizing node within this larger configuration. In this phase, the mansion was not merely surviving, it was necessary. External systems relied on it to maintain balance. Its existence reduced uncertainty. Its decisions, however indirectly expressed, were treated as signals. The building fulfilled the assumptions encoded into its design. Authority was quiet, insulated, and enduring. The mansion did not need to defend its relevance because relevance had not yet been questioned. During this period, the mansion's influence was most evident in what did not occur. Challenges were preempted. Conflicts resolved before becoming visible. Competing interests adjusted their behavior without direct instruction. The building's authority functioned through anticipation rather than reaction. Those who interacted with the mansion understood its rhythms. Engagement was deliberate. Timing mattered more than argument. A conversation held too early or too publicly could be rendered ineffective. The mansion rewarded restraint. Those who respected its tempo found access. Those who did not were quietly excluded. Internally, confidence replaced caution. Systems that once existed to protect against uncertainty now facilitated action. Procedures streamlined rather than constrained. Familiarity allowed for efficiency without exposure. The mansion's routines, honed over years, operated at maximum effectiveness. This was also the point at which influence extended furthest beyond the property. Decisions shaped markets, institutions, and cultural expectations without requiring attribution. The mansion's role was understood by those who mattered, even if it remained invisible to those who did not. Power did not need recognition to be effective. The alignment between internal deliberation and external consequence created a feedback loop. Successful outcomes reinforced confidence in the system. Confidence justified further reliance on discretion and continuity. The mansion became a reference point for stability in an environment that valued predictability. Importantly, authority here was collective rather than centralized. No single individual dominated the space. Influence emerged from consensus built through repetition and shared assumption. This diffusion protected the system from disruption. The mansion could lose participants without losing coherence. The building's physical presence amplified this effect. Its permanence suggested inevitability. Its isolation implied independence. Those qualities translated into authority even in absence. The mansion exerted influence simply by remaining unchanged while external conditions fluctuated. At its peak, the house required little maintenance of meaning. Its role was self-evident within the circles that relied on it. Cultural deference remained intact. Privacy was still interpreted as seriousness, withdrawal as discipline. This was the era in which the mansion most fully embodied its original purpose. It did not merely host power, it synchronized it. Architecture, routine, and context aligned to produce sustained influence without exposure. What followed would not come from internal failure. The system functioned as designed. The change would come from outside, when alignment began to fracture and the conditions that once made the mansion indispensable slowly shifted beyond its control. The first signs of pressure did not arrive as threat, they arrived as adjustment. External systems that had once moved in quiet coordination with the mansion began to introduce friction, small at first, procedural rather than ideological. New reporting requirements, expanded oversight, shifts in how legitimacy was demonstrated rather than assumed. None of this targeted the mansion directly. That was precisely the problem. The building had been designed to operate beyond visibility, not against it. As regulatory environments evolved, they did not accuse or confront. They asked to see. They asked to document. They asked to explain. These requests did not halt activity, but they changed its texture. Processes that once relied on discretion now required articulation. Economic forces introduced a different kind of pressure. Capital became more mobile, more fragmented, and more sensitive to public signaling. Long-term patience, once an advantage, began to resemble inertia. Markets rewarded speed and transparency in ways the mansion was not built to accommodate. The building's strength, its ability to delay, slowly lost its strategic value. Cultural expectations shifted as well. Privacy, once interpreted as seriousness, began to attract suspicion. Withdrawal no longer implied discipline. It suggested detachment. The social order that had granted deference to elite silence weakened, replaced by demands for visibility and justification. The mansion's refusal to perform began to read not as authority, but as absence. None of this produced immediate disruption. The mansion continued to function. Routines remained intact. Staff roles did not change. Meetings still occurred. But the assumptions underpinning those routines no longer aligned perfectly with the external environment. The building's internal logic persisted even as its external relevance subtly eroded. This misalignment created strain without rupture. The mansion was not challenged directly, it was bypassed. Decisions increasingly occurred elsewhere, closer to regulatory centers, markets, or public institutions. The building remained informed, but less central. Influence thinned at the edges before receding at the core. Importantly, the mansion did not respond by adapting visibly. Adaptation would have required acknowledging that the system sustaining it was changing. Instead, continuity was preserved. Existing procedures were maintained with greater care, as if precision could compensate for relevance. This period was defined by management rather than leadership. Adjustments were incremental. Exposure was minimized. Engagement with external forces was cautious and indirect. The goal was not expansion or reinvention, but preservation of function for as long as possible. Pressure accumulated quietly. Each shift was defensible in isolation. None constituted a crisis. But together, they altered the conditions that had once made the mansion indispensable. Authority no longer flowed automatically through the building. It required translation, explanation, and alignment with systems that operated on different terms. The mansion remained intact. Its systems continued to operate. Yet the environment that once validated its logic was no longer stable. What had changed was not the structure itself, but the context that had given it meaning. As this pressure accumulated, the mansion's role shifted from origin to intermediary. It no longer initiated alignment, it interpreted it. External developments arrived already formed, requiring accommodation rather than shaping. The building's authority narrowed from directive to consultative, though this change was rarely acknowledged internally. Financial flows reflected the same pattern. Capital no longer lingered. It passed through more quickly, subject to external timelines and expectations. The mansion still provided oversight, but oversight without leverage is administrative. Influence persisted, but it required negotiation rather than assumption. The building's response was disciplined restraint. Visibility was controlled more tightly. Engagement was limited to familiar channels. The logic was consistent with the mansion's founding principles. Withdrawal preserves authority. What had changed was the environment's interpretation of that withdrawal. Internally, routines continued to enforce continuity, but their purpose subtly shifted. Processes that once facilitated decision now managed exposure. Documentation increased, not to create transparency, but to defend discretion. The system grew more careful, more inward-facing. This inward turn was not reactionary, it was methodical. The mansion did not resist change openly. It insulated itself against it. But insulation works only when external forces move slowly. As cultural and economic pressures accelerated, insulation began to resemble isolation. The most telling shift occurred in how time was used. Delay, once a strategic advantage, began to impose cost. Waiting no longer discouraged challengers, it invited them to proceed without consultation. The mansion's patience was no longer universally respected. It became optional. Still, nothing collapsed. The building remained operational. Its authority diminished without confrontation. The system did not fail, it aged. The assumptions that once guaranteed relevance no longer held universally, but they had not yet been fully invalidated. This ambiguity prolonged the transition. Without a crisis to force reevaluation, the mansion continued to operate as if alignment could be restored. Preservation replaced adaptation. The structure remained committed to a logic that had not yet been decisively rejected. Pressure without crisis is the most difficult condition for elite systems to interpret. There is no moment of failure to correct, no event to explain the shift. Influence simply becomes less effective, less central, less necessary. By the end of this phase, the mansion still appeared authoritative. Its presence was still respected. But its role had changed quietly. Power no longer required it in the way it once had. The building had not been displaced. It had been outpaced. The system continued, intact and disciplined, even as the ground beneath its logic slowly moved. The transition did not announce itself as abandonment. It arrived as efficiency, as streamlining, as a series of reasonable decisions that, taken together, altered the mansion's internal meaning without disturbing its exterior order. Stewardship did not end, it was redefined. Where the building had once been maintained to support a system of influence, it was now maintained to preserve value. This distinction mattered. Maintenance shifted from enabling function to protecting asset integrity. Decisions about staffing, use, and access were evaluated less by their contribution to authority and more by their cost, exposure, and return. The mansion's routines persisted, but they thinned. Roles were consolidated. Functions that had once required human presence were automated or outsourced. The building remained impeccably run, yet increasingly empty of the relationships that had animated it. What remained was structure without density. This was not neglect, it was rationalization. The mansion no longer needed the full apparatus of discretion it once supported. Influence no longer originated here, so the systems designed to shield it became redundant. Their removal appeared prudent rather than destructive. Financial logic now governed decisions that had previously been cultural. Spaces were assessed for utilization rather than purpose. Rooms that once hosted quiet alignments sat unused yet continued to be heated, cleaned, and insured. Their value was measured abstractly, not functionally. As influence decentered, the mansion's role narrowed. It no longer synchronized power, it stored it. Capital associated with the property became less liquid in meaning, more liquid in accounting. The building entered portfolios where its worth could be compared, leveraged, or deferred without reference to its original function. This shift altered internal priorities. Preservation focused on appearance and compliance rather than continuity of practice. The goal was to ensure the mansion remained transferable. Legally, financially, symbolically, even if it was no longer operationally central. The building became legible to external systems that had once deferred to it. Extraction replaced cultivation, not in the sense of physical stripping, but in the redirection of value outward. The mansion generated prestige, collateral, and optionality rather than influence. Its existence could support decisions made elsewhere, but it no longer shaped those decisions directly. Culturally, this hollowing was difficult to perceive. The building looked the same. Its standards remained high, its privacy intact, but the internal logic had changed. Authority no longer accumulated through presence. It dissipated through abstraction. The mansion began to function as a symbol divorced from process. Its name retained weight, but that weight traveled independently of the building itself. Influence could be invoked without being exercised there. The house became a reference point rather than a site. This phase favored simplification. Complexity without necessity became risk. The mansion's internal ecosystem, once valued for its stability, was now seen as excess. Reducing it appeared responsible. Each reduction was justified on its own terms. Together, they altered the building's relationship to power. By the end of this stage, the mansion was still valuable. In some measures, more so than before. But its value was no longer catalytic. It did not generate influence. It preserved it in latent form. The structure remained intact. The engine had been removed quietly, piece by piece, without ever turning the building off. As the mansion's internal density diminished, its external flexibility increased. Freed from the demands of active influence, the building could now accommodate new forms of valuation. Its significance became measurable in ways that authority never was. Appraisals replaced assumptions. Reports replaced memory. The mansion entered systems that required clarity rather than discretion. This shift altered how decisions about the building were justified. Choices were no longer framed in terms of legacy or continuity, but in terms of optimization, risk mitigation, cost efficiency, future optionality. The language surrounding the mansion changed, even if its appearance did not. With this came a redefinition of access. Entry was governed less by alignment and more by necessity. Specialists replaced confidants. Contractors replaced long-serving staff. Knowledge became segmented. No one needed to understand the whole system anymore, because the system itself had ceased to operate as a whole. The mansion's silence deepened. Where once it absorbed deliberation, it now absorbed absence. Rooms remained intact, but unused. Systems functioned without purpose beyond preservation. The building no longer anticipated decision, it endured waiting. This endurance carried a different quality than before. It was no longer strategic patience, it was suspension. The mansion was prepared for multiple futures without committing to any of them. Sale, transfer, conversion, continued holding, all remained possible. Indeterminacy replaced intent. Influence, now fully decentered, passed through the building only symbolically. Its presence reassured stakeholders elsewhere. The mansion lent gravity to documents and negotiations conducted far from its walls. It no longer needed to be activated to matter in abstraction. At the same time, the building became easier to detach from those who once defined it. Stewardship, having lost its cultural grounding, could be reassigned. Responsibility became contractual rather than relational. This reduced risk but also severed continuity. What remained was an immaculate structure governed by external logic. Its internal rhythms no longer shaped outcomes. They preserved readiness. The mansion stood complete, simplified, and hollowed of its original role. This condition allowed it to survive. But survival now depended on its adaptability as an asset, not its authority as an institution. The building had crossed a threshold from engine to instrument. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing was violated. The transformation was thorough precisely because it was rational. The mansion endured, not as a center of power, but as a container of residual value, capable of being moved, reassigned, or held indefinitely. Here, the hollowing was complete. The structure remained, but its influence no longer originated within. Power had not left in protest. It had simply stopped needing the place that once sustained it. What survives inside the mansion is not power, but form. The building continues to operate, though the definition of operation has narrowed considerably. Systems remain active. Staff remain present. Protocols remain enforced. Yet the purpose these mechanisms once served has receded, leaving behind a carefully maintained framework whose original function is no longer required. The mansion still opens and closes according to schedule. Security procedures are observed. Environmental controls preserve interior conditions with precision. These actions create the impression of continuity. But continuity of motion is not continuity of role. The building functions now as a regulated environment rather than an active system. Certain rituals persist, though stripped of necessity. Rooms are prepared as if gatherings might occur. Table settings follow inherited conventions. Movement through the building respects long-established patterns. These gestures no longer facilitate influence, they commemorate it. Ritual has shifted from instrument to aesthetic. What remains operational is preservation itself. The mansion's primary activity is maintaining readiness without expectation. Readiness for what is deliberately undefined. The building is kept intact, not to enable action, but to prevent irreversible change. Preservation becomes the final discipline. Staff roles reflect this contraction. Expertise is now technical rather than relational. Knowledge concerns systems, materials, compliance. The deep familiarity that once connected individuals to the mansion's internal culture has thinned. Continuity survives in manuals and schedules rather than memory. The house still enforces distance, but distance no longer produces leverage. Privacy is maintained as a condition of ownership, not as a strategy of power. The building's separation from public life no longer shapes outcomes, it merely avoids engagement. Some spaces retain a residual gravity, their proportions still imply deliberation. Their silence still feels intentional. But nothing converges there now. These rooms no longer anchor decisions. They hold atmosphere without consequence. What has permanently disappeared is density. The layering of relationships, assumptions, and informal authority that once filled the mansion cannot be restored through maintenance. It required active alignment with external systems that no longer depend on this place. Once decentered, such alignment does not return by default. The building continues to suggest importance because it was designed to do so. Architecture outlasts relevance. The mansion still looks prepared for authority. It still behaves as if influence could arrive at any moment. But behavior is not belief. The system that once animated these forms has moved elsewhere. This leaves the mansion in a state of curated survival. It remains functional, but narrowly so. Its operations now serve the building itself rather than a larger network of power. The house has become self-referential, sustaining its own condition without extending influence outward. What survives then is structure without urgency, ritual without consequence, presence without necessity. The mansion endures, but in a reduced state, active, intact, and fundamentally incomplete. This narrowed function reshapes how the mansion is perceived from within. Without the pressure of consequence, time settles differently. Days no longer anticipate convergence. Weeks pass without accumulation. The building exists in a sustained present, managed rather than inhabited by purpose. Survival now depends on predictability. The mansion's continued relevance is tied to its ability to remain unchanged. Alteration introduces questions. Questions invite reassessment. Stability, even when empty of meaning, discourages both. The building survives by avoiding decision. In this state, aesthetics assume disproportionate weight. Surfaces are preserved with care. Objects remain positioned according to inherited logic. These choices communicate continuity to those who encounter the space, even as that continuity is no longer functional. Appearance becomes the final language of legitimacy. The rituals that remain are performed because they are expected, not because they produce effect. They reassure owners, caretakers, and observers that nothing has been lost that cannot be maintained. Ritual becomes confirmation rather than action. What cannot survive is improvisation. The mansion no longer tolerates it. Without a living system to absorb variance, deviation becomes risk. The building prefers repetition precisely because repetition cannot fail in visible ways. This further distances it from its former role as a site of active alignment. Externally, the mansion's presence still carries symbolic weight. It anchors narratives of heritage and continuity. It reassures by existing. Yet this reassurance operates independently of any influence the building might exert. The symbol has detached from the system that created it. Internally, memory persists unevenly. Some knowledge remains embedded in routines and spatial logic. Other knowledge, contextual, relational, strategic, has dissipated. Without repetition at scale, memory thins. The mansion retains habits without understanding their original necessity. This condition produces a quiet dissonance. The building continues to behave as if authority could reappear, yet nothing arrives to require it. The structure waits without expectation. Waiting itself becomes the function. What is gone cannot be restored through preservation alone. Influence required synchronization with external forces that have since reorganized. The mansion cannot summon that alignment by remaining intact. Its survival is passive rather than generative. And yet, The building does not feel ruined. It feels resolved. Its current state is coherent on its own terms. It is a completed object rather than a living system. The absence of urgency lends it calm. In this way, the mansion reaches a final equilibrium. It no longer strains to matter. It exists as a maintained remainder of a former logic, neither contested nor activated. The rituals that persist do so because they are harmless. What survives is enough to keep the building standing, protected, and legible as significant. What is gone is the necessity that once made it indispensable. The mansion remains operational, but its operations now serve endurance alone. This is not decline in the dramatic sense. It is narrowing, a reduction of function until only preservation remains. The house continues, intact and controlled, carrying forward the shape of power long after the power itself has departed. The mansion's legacy does not announce itself through collapse or scandal. It does not require excavation or exposure. Its meaning lies in what it demonstrates quietly, the manner in which elite power concludes when it no longer needs to defend itself, transform itself, or even explain itself. It does not fall. It recedes until it becomes optional. From the outside, the building appears resolved. It is neither contested nor reclaimed. Its continued existence suggests success. Survival is often mistaken for relevance. Yet what the mansion represents now is not authority, but completion. A system that has finished its work does not disappear. It leaves structures behind. This is the distinctive ending of elite institutions. They do not announce defeat. They persist past necessity. Their final expression is maintenance rather than action. The mansion remains because removing it would require acknowledging that its logic has expired. Preservation allows the system to avoid that admission. The building, therefore, becomes a record rather than a participant. It documents a form of power that once required insulation, patience, and invisibility to function. Its walls still embody those assumptions, even though the conditions that justified them no longer dominate the environment beyond the gates. What gives the mansion its quiet gravity is that nothing dramatic forced this outcome. There was no reckoning that demanded adaptation, no decisive moment that marked the end. Power simply reorganized elsewhere, adopting forms better suited to speed, visibility, and distributed control. The mansion was not rejected. It was outgrown. In this way, the building stands as evidence of how authority changes shape. Systems that once relied on permanence eventually favor flexibility. Those that once valued withdrawal eventually require presence. The mansion did not fail to evolve. It was never designed to. Its strength lay in resisting change. That same strength became its limit. The legacy here is not moral, it is structural. The mansion reveals how deeply power invests in continuity and how reluctant it is to dismantle the environments that once sustained it. Even when influence departs, the structure remains, maintained as proof that what once mattered still deserves care. This produces a particular kind of silence. Not secrecy, not neglect, but resolution. The building no longer waits to be activated. It exists as a finished expression of a worldview that assumed permanence was achievable. Its continued presence does not assert relevance. It asserts memory. What lingers is not the mansion itself, but the pattern it represents. The tendency of elite systems to leave behind intact architectures long after their function has migrated. The landscape is filled with such structures, maintained, protected, and hollow of necessity. The question raised by this mansion is therefore not historical. It is institutional. How many environments still stand, absorbing resources and attention simply because dismantling them would require admitting that their purpose has already passed? The mansion offers no answer. It does not need to. Its continued existence is the answer it provides, quietly, without argument, and without urgency. In its present state, the mansion does not instruct, it does not warn, it does not commemorate itself overtly. Its legacy is implicit, embedded in the way it occupies space without demanding interpretation. The building remains because it can, not because it must. This endurance reflects a particular confidence common to elite systems at their end. When power is no longer contested, it no longer needs to justify itself. The mansion's survival is not strategic, it is habitual. Resources continue to flow toward it because they always have. Maintenance persists because disruption would require attention, and attention invites reassessment. What the building preserves is not influence, but a memory of how influence once behaved. Its scale recalls patience. Its isolation recalls authority exercised without exposure. Its silence recalls a time when withdrawal signaled control rather than irrelevance. These signals no longer govern the present, but they remain legible in form. The mansion therefore occupies a space between relevance and redundancy. It is not obsolete in material terms. It remains usable, transferable, defensible. Yet it no longer organizes power. It does not attract decision. It does not anchor alignment. Its role is complete. This completion does not invite closure. Elite systems rarely conclude cleanly. They taper. They leave residues. Structures remain because removal offers no advantage. The mansion stands as one such residue, maintained not for what it does, but for what it once represented. In this way, the building becomes a measure of change without marking it. The absence of activity inside it reflects transformations that occurred elsewhere. Power has redistributed, accelerated, and exposed itself to forms of scrutiny that this place was designed to avoid. The mansion did not adapt because adaptation would have compromised its identity. Its legacy, then, is architectural honesty. The building continues to express the assumptions of its origin without modification. It does not pretend to belong to the present. It simply remains intact within it. This persistence raises no immediate demand. The mansion does not need to be repurposed or dismantled to resolve its meaning. Its existence is already sufficient commentary. It demonstrates how authority concludes when it has no incentive to continue asserting itself. What remains unresolved is not the fate of this house, but the broader pattern it belongs to. Across landscapes shaped by accumulation and control, similar structures endure, operational, protected, and unnecessary. They stand not as failures, but as completions. The mansion's quiet legacy is therefore structural rather than narrative. It shows how elite power prefers to end, not in collapse, not in confrontation, but in maintenance. By becoming unnecessary and remaining anyway, nothing more is required of it. The building has finished its work.